This morning, we're going to begin a series of sermons in which we're going to walk with the disciples to Easter. Certainly at times this was an exhilarating journey, but it was also a bewildering one. Now we're going to use Luke's gospel as our guide for this excursion. And there's a few things that we hope to accomplish. We want to see Jesus through the eyes of those who were closest to him. We want to experience the wonder and the terror that sometimes accompanied close proximity with Jesus. We want to learn what God's kingdom and Christ's mission were really all about. And we want to receive the forgiveness, comfort, the instruction, and the commissioning that can only come from Jesus. Now, as you'll see up here, we've got 7 sermons that we're going to go through here, and we're going to make our way, as we've already said, through the Gospel of Luke. But the first sermon is going to be on the text that Natalia read for us this morning. And it is a text of great importance for Luke. You see, for Luke, Peter functions as a case study in the process and the results of discipleship. Luke will follow Peter throughout his 2-volume work. And this is what Luke is trying to say. Encountering Jesus means encountering ourselves. And if we take that encounter seriously, it will change the trajectory of our lives. Now, this is an interesting story, so let's set the stage for it. And let's really try to put Peter's skin on. Let's try to see things through Peter's eyes. Here he is by the Sea of Galilee. That's what the Lake of Gennesaret is. It's the Sea of Galilee. And actually, Luke is more accurate in terms of sort of technical geography. This is an inland lake. It's about, at least today, it's about 64 square miles, which is about the size of Lake Washita in southwest Arkansas, or Greer's Ferry Lake in north central Arkansas, but I couldn't find one around here that it was close to. All the ones around here are too small. It's a pretty big sized lake, but it is an inland lake with fresh water. And it was a place where people went to fish, not just recreationally, in fact, probably not primarily recreationally, but commercially. And that's what Peter and his people are. They are professional fishermen. And they're sitting by the shore, washing out their nets from the previous night's work. Washing out the silt and the vegetable matter and all that kind of stuff. And you can just imagine, Peter's worked all night, he's tired, and all of a sudden he sees this Jesus guy come. Now, the way Luke structures his story, Peter knows who Jesus is. He knows who Jesus is. In fact, he's had Jesus in his home. Jesus has healed his mother-in-law. But Peter hasn't really encountered Jesus. Not in the way that he's about to. So Peter just keeps washing his nets because he's got work to do. And I'm sure it was maybe even mildly distracting to hear this low buzz, this low roar around him as the crowds are gathering. And then a hush falls and Jesus starts to teach. And, maybe Peter's listening a little bit, maybe not. And all of a sudden, Jesus comes over and says, "Hey, Peter, I need to borrow your boat." Now, the text tells us that Jesus is trying to get a little bit of distance from the crowd, and that's undoubtedly what he was trying to do. But there's something else going on here too. Human voice carries across water. I've actually experienced this one time. I was doing a youth event for the last church we were in. There were about 50 kids there, and a bunch of adults too. And when it was time for me to speak, we were at somebody's house. And when it was time to speak, the youth minister said, "Okay, we're going to put you over on this side of the pool, and we're going to put the kids all around the other side of the pool." If I'd been doing it, I would have just gathered them around me. I would have just stood in the middle of them. But he said, "No, this will work." Sure enough, he was right. Nobody had trouble hearing me, even though in the middle of my talk, a train went by in the distance. We know what that's like here, don't we? So that's probably part of Jesus' calculus too. And the boat allows Jesus to sit while also allowing people to see him. So Jesus is up there just kind of talking away. And when his talk is over, that's when something amazing happens. We have this miracle that is also a parable. This is my father-in-law up here, having caught a fish. Him catching a fish is not a miracle. I think that man can roll out of bed and fish would just jump into his boat. I don't know what it is, but what Jesus does is even more remarkable. When Jesus finishes his talk, he asks Peter, "Put out into deep water." And if that's all he had said, Peter might have thought, well, okay, maybe he wants to get some distance from the crowd. Maybe he wants them to disperse a little bit while he prays or rests. But that's not all he said. He said, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets." Apparently, Peter had finished his net washing job, and they were in the boat with him, along with his hired people. And you gotta understand how Peter probably feels about this. So here Peter is, he's a professional fisherman. He knows what he's doing. And he worked his tail off the night before and didn't catch anything. And here this erstwhile carpenter turned itinerant preacher is telling him, "Hey, let down your nets. You're going to catch some fish." That would be like me telling Bobby, "Hey, you need to breed your cattle with that bull and not this bull." He would have every right to look at me and say, "What do you know about that?" Or it'd be like me telling Sheila, "You're taking the blood pressure wrong. You're supposed to do it this way, not that way." She'd probably whop me upside the head with a hymnal. And rightly so. Right? What do I know about taking blood pressure? But Peter, he understands a little bit. He doesn't understand everything that's going on, of course. He understands a little bit. Notice that he calls Jesus Master. The Greek word is epistota. It is Luke's way of translating the Hebrew word rabbi. And there is a very real sense in which Jesus is Peter's social superior. And so Peter does what Jesus says. He goes out into deep water. He lets down the nets. And all of a sudden, ruh-roh, we got a problem. We got too many fish for our net. It's an amazing, amazing thing. So Peter's, you can just see him flailing his arms and yelling, James, John, get over here, And they come over, and they start hauling in fish and hauling in fish and hauling in fish. And you can see they're all looking at each other going, how are we going to get these boats back to shore? Remember, I said that this miracle is a parable. It teaches something. It symbolizes something that's going to be true about Peter's life. And that is true about Jesus' ministry. But Peter doesn't realize that yet. In fact, it may have been years or decades before Peter thought back on this event and went, oh, that's what Jesus was doing. You see, Peter is about to become the fish that catches other fish. But he doesn't know that yet. No, Peter's got something else going on. He has seen himself as he really is. Notice Peter's reaction. Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. The reaction may be peculiar, but his rationale, I think, makes sense to a lot of us. I'm a sinner. You can't be anywhere around me because I'll contaminate you. That's the way people thought in the ancient world. Impurity contaminates purity. Unholiness contaminates holiness. Sinfulness contaminates righteousness. But here is the remarkable thing about the kingdom of God. That's not how it works. And especially, that's not how anything works with Jesus. Shortly after this, there'll be another, I guess we could call it a parabolic miracle, where Jesus is encountered by a man with leprosy. And that man bows before Jesus and says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, I am willing, be cleansed. And it is not uncommon for Jesus to reach out and grab hold of a leper in order to cleanse them. Because Jesus is so powerful, so holy, so good, that evil has no hold on him. Impurity has no hold on him. Unholiness has no hold on him. Sinfulness has no hold on him. But that's not how Peter's thinking. Peter's thinking, I got to get this guy out of here before I mess up everything. It's not an unprecedented reaction. It's how Adam and Eve reacted in the garden. They sinned. And instead of running to God and throwing themselves on their faces before Him and saying, we messed up, we did what you told us not to do, they hid. It's what the people of Israel did at Mount Sinai. God spoke. They heard His very voice, and it scared them to death. They were like, whoa, we survived that once. We won't survive it again. Hey, Moses, don't let God speak to us. You speak to us. We'll listen to you. But whatever you do, don't let God speak to us. That was terrifying. It is a natural human reaction. It's just what people do. Now, let's address a little side question here. Is Peter actually sinful? Or is this just his shame talking? Because that is, in fact, what's happening in these previous experiences is shame is driving, whether it be Adam and Eve or the people of Israel, away from God. Shame's not an inappropriate reaction. But what's going on here? Because sometimes our shame is overactive. And sometimes it causes us to react in ways that are actually not helpful for us. The first thing that we need to observe is just this simple historical fact. Galileans were no less law observant than other Jews. They were looked down upon, sure enough, by the Jerusalem elite. But Galileans were as observant of the law as anybody else was. Moreover, people had a tendency, at least some people had a tendency to look down on fishermen, thinking it a disreputable occupation. Of course, those same people probably ate fish whenever they could, but, you know, that's how we are as humans. But it's also true, as Paul reminds us, that all of us fall short when we are compared with God. All of us fall short when we are compared with God. So when you look at our question there, the answer to the question is, well, it's both. Yes, Peter sees himself as he really is, maybe for the first time. All of his pretensions to holiness, all of his pretensions to righteousness, they've just all gone out the window. Peter now realizes that he is not what he thought he was. But at the same time, that sense of unworthiness is exaggerated and distorted by the fear, by the shame. So how does Jesus respond? Well, I think it's important to highlight a couple of things that Jesus does not say. Jesus does not say, oh, Peter, you're not that bad. But he also doesn't say, oh, good, Peter, I'm glad you realized you're a dirty, rotten scumbag. No. How does Jesus respond? He responds by saying, don't be afraid. Now, when somebody tells you, don't be afraid, the level of comfort in that sentence really kind of depends on the person and their ability to address whatever it is that you're afraid of, right? So if a tiger walks in the door over here, and I tell all of you, now don't be afraid, that's not going to do you a bit of good, is it? You're going to be like, good. You can stand there and not be afraid. I'm going out the nearest window. Now, if a tiger walks in the door and the tiger's trainer is with him and he says, don't be afraid, well, that certainly carries more credibility than if I say it. But you still are going to have some quaky quivery in your heart, right? But if the God who created the tiger walks in and says, don't be afraid, that's different, isn't it? That's different. Now, think about this. Jesus is saying to Peter, don't be afraid. A couple of stories from now, Jesus is going to be in a house. And he's going to be teaching some people. And some guys are going to dig a hole in a roof and lower a paralyzed man down to him. I was just sitting here thinking about how weird that would be. In the middle of one of my sermons, this guy comes down on a pallet right in front of me here. That'd just be strange. It's just part of Jesus' life, apparently. I don't know. Do you remember what Jesus says? He doesn't say, first, get up and walk. What he says is, take heart, son. Your sins are forgiven. And then, of course, the religious know-it-alls, people like me, are sitting around going, hey, what does this guy think he's doing? He doesn't have the right to forgive sins. Only God can do that. And Jesus says, I know what you're thinking. I know you don't think I have the right to do this. I'm going to show you that I do. And then he tells the man, get up and walk. He looks back at everybody and he says, see, I have the authority to forgive sins. So when Jesus tells Peter, don't be afraid, he has credibility. Peter may not recognize all of that credibility yet, but he will. He will. Notice, too, that this is a consistent refrain of those who speak on behalf of God to his people. They say, don't be afraid. Over and over again, don't be afraid. Peter probably recognizes that. But then Jesus says something else to Peter, and it's very, very interesting. He says, the NIV translates it something like, I'm going to send you out to catch people. In part because I'm going to make you fishers of men just doesn't communicate very well in English anymore. But Jesus is offering Peter a new relationship, a relationship with himself. And he's offering him a new vocation. Peter isn't going to be a fisherman anymore. He's first going to be a student, and then he's going to be a catcher of people. I don't even know what you would call that. And in the process, what he's doing is he's giving Peter a new identity. Now, there's an upside and a downside to that. The downside is Peter's no longer going to be the boss. It's clear from the way that the story is structured that Peter is the one who runs the boat. He's the captain. Peter is the captain of his boat. That's not how it's going to be anymore. Peter's not going to be the boss. He's going to be a learner just like everybody else. But at the same time, he's also going to have a new profession. He's going to have a new identity. And that identity is going to be positive. It's going to be one that restores Peter's dignity. Before, Peter is now he's a pretty successful businessman from everything we can tell, but he's just a businessman who catches and sells fish on the wholesale market. Now, he's going to be part of a movement that changes the world. He was someone that people looked down upon. In times to come, he's going to be someone that people look up to. Now, what do we learn from all of this? How are we to make sense of it all? Well, I think there's 3 lessons we can learn. First is this. Shame is the natural consequence of sin. But hiding our distorted character, our disordered desires, and our destructive actions from God doesn't do us any good. He can't forgive us, and He can't heal us as long as we hide. As long as we're not honest with Him and honest with ourselves. The second lesson is that Jesus didn't just come to forgive us. He did that. But He didn't just come to forgive us. He came to invite us onto a journey. One that reorders our values. One that reforms our identity. One that restores our dignity. You do know, don't you? That's what sin does. Sin robs us of our dignity. It distorts our identity. It gets our values and our desires all out of order. Jesus came to change all that. Now, the third part of this, third lesson we learn, may not be as profound as the first 2, but it's just as important. The journey that Jesus leads us on takes time, takes commitment, and it takes humility. This stuff doesn't all just happen all at once. It happens over a long period of time. And there are going to be times when our faith is going to be tested in that journey. And of course, the journey requires us to lay aside any pretensions to being in charge. Any notions that we already know everything that we need to know. But Jesus doesn't send us on this journey alone. He walks with us. And He calls us into the fellowship of others who are on the same journey that we are. It is a beautiful journey. And it is a journey we're going to talk about for the rest of Lent. Let us pray.